The bell above the door had a particular sound, not a sharp ring, but a soft, tired chime, like it had announced too many visitors over too many years, and had learned not to get excited. Margaret Calhoun had hung it herself, back when she first opened Petal and Pine on the corner of Decatur and 9th, and she liked it precisely because it didn't demand attention. It simply noted arrival. She was trimming the stems on a batch of white dahlias when the two officers walked in on a grey Tuesday morning in late October. The shop smelled of eucalyptus and damp soil. Rain had been threatening since dawn. Margaret didn't look up immediately. She'd learned long ago that people reveal more in the first few seconds when they think they're unobserved. These two weren't browsing. She could tell by the way they moved, deliberate, unhurried, spreading out slightly as they entered the way men do when they want to fill a space and remind you of it. The one on the left was heavyset, with a jaw like a kitchen cabinet door. His partner was younger, trimmer, with a kind of careful stillness that comes from practice rather than calm. "Mrs. Calhoun," the heavier one said. "Miss," she replied, setting down her shears. "And yes," he introduced himself as Officer Dale Pruitt. His partner was Officer Kevin Straw. They were from the 14th Precinct, he said, which she already knew because she recognized the badge configuration and the shoulder patch. She'd made it a habit, over the years, to know things like that. "We're part of the business liaison program," Pruitt said, pulling out a laminated card that looked like it had been designed on a home printer. "Kind of a community safety initiative. Merchants in this corridor contribute to a fund helps us keep extra patrols in the area. Make sure incidents get responded to fast." He set the card on her counter. "Given the break-ins last spring, we figured you'd want to be part of it." Margaret looked at the card. Then she looked at Pruitt. Then at Straw, who was examining a display of preserved moss arrangements with performed interest. "How much?" she said. "$400 a month." Pruitt said, "Cash is simplest." She nodded slowly. The way she nodded when someone gave her information she intended to use later. "And if I'm not interested in participating?" Pruitt smiled. It was the kind of smile that knew exactly what it was doing. "Well, ma'am, we can't guarantee response times if you're not part of the program. Things happen. Calls get delayed. You know how it is short-staffed. Lots of ground to cover. I do know how it is." She said, "Great." He picked up the card and held it out to her. "First contribution is due by Friday. We swing by in the morning, usually around 9. She took the card, looked at it once more. "I'll think about it," she said. They left. The bell made its tired sound. Margaret stood very still for a moment, then set the card down on the counter beside her shears. She picked up her phone, scrolled to a name she hadn't dialed in nearly 2 years, and pressed call. It rang 3 times. "Holt," said the voice on the other end. "It's Margaret." She said, "I need 48 hours, and then I need you to make some calls." "A pause. Then how bad?" "Local," she said. "Not complicated, but it needs to be done right." "Understood. Standing by." She hung up, went back to her dahlias, and continued trimming. Margaret Calhoun had not always sold flowers. For 11 years before Petal and Pine, she had served in roles that didn't appear on any public roster. She'd been recruited out of Army intelligence at 26, cross-trained, and eventually attached through channels that don't get discussed at press briefings to a support and assessment unit operating alongside 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. She wasn't a trigger puller. Her work was assessment, source validation, and what the unit euphemistically called atmospheric development, the slow, patient business of understanding a human environment well enough to predict what would happen before it happened. She had spent time in places where the rules of engagement were written in pencil and erased often. She had sat across tables from men who were very dangerous and very certain of themselves. and she had learned to read the specific texture of that certainty, how it moved, where it was hollow, when it was about to crack. Pruitt had that texture. She'd recognized it the moment he set the laminated card on her counter. She had left the service at 38. Not because she was asked to leave, but because she had watched too many operations succeed tactically while failing at every other level. And she had concluded, quietly and without drama, that she needed a different kind of work. She'd moved back to her mother's hometown of Radcliffe, Virginia, a mid-sized city, with a riverfront and a struggling downtown, and opened the flower shop because she genuinely loved flowers. And because a flower shop was the kind of business that required careful attention to living things, which suited her. She had not told her neighbors what she used to do. She had not told her employees a part-time college student named Bex and a semi-retired arranger named Howard, who came in 3 mornings a week. She had not told the city councillor, who occasionally bought tulips for his wife, or the funeral director, who was her largest wholesale account, or the young woman from the bakery 2 doors down, who sometimes shared the doorstep with her on slow afternoons. She had, however, told one person, her sister Claire, who had responded by saying, "I always knew you were weird," and then asking if she wanted to come to Thanksgiving. The point was that when Pruitt and Straw came in with their laminated card and their implied threats, they were not dealing with a retired school teacher who would pay out of fear and say nothing. They were dealing with someone who had spent over a decade learning precisely how to dismantle systems of coercive power patiently, thoroughly, and without leaving unnecessary wreckage. She began the next morning. The first thing Margaret did was call the 14th precinct directly, not to report the visit, but to ask a routine administrative question about business licensing requirements in the district, using a name and a callback number that weren't hers. While she had the clerk on the line, she established that there was no official business liaison program registered with the precinct. The clerk had never heard of it. The second thing she did was talk to her neighbor, a man named Gareth Soules, who ran an alterations shop 3 blocks away. She stopped by under the pretext of dropping off a small arrangement, a standing habit. They exchanged services and worked the conversation around to whether he'd had any unusual visits lately. It took 8 minutes. He had the same 2 officers. 6 months ago, he'd been paying $200 a month since then. Cash. And had told nobody, because Pruitt had strongly implied that the fire marshal's office could become very interested in the alterations shop's ventilation situation if he caused problems. The third thing she did was call Holt back and tell him what she had. Warren Holt was not, technically, a federal agent anymore. He had retired from a position within the Defense Intelligence Agency 4 years prior, and now worked as a security consultant in a capacity that was deliberately vague. But he had a network, and that network had nodes in places that mattered. And he had been in a different chapter of both their lives, Margaret's operational supervisor for 3 years, in circumstances that created a particular kind of trust. "How many businesses?" he asked. "I know of 2. I think there are more. I need a few more days to map it. Don't go wide yet. Stay quiet. Collect names, amounts, dates. I know how to do this. Warren, I know you do. I'm saying it anyway, because I care about you." She smiled at her phone. "I'll be in touch." Over the next 5 days, Margaret moved through her neighborhood the way she had once moved through the back streets of cities whose names she still couldn't say aloud in most company. She was not obvious about it. She attended the monthly meeting of the Decatur Street Merchants Association, where she had been a member for 3 years, and was known for bringing good coffee and saying little. She listened. She helped a Vietnamese restaurant owner named Tran reorganize his storage room, and, in the process, learned that he had also been visited 300 a month. 7 months running. She ran into a woman who owned a bookshop on 11th who admitted, after 40 minutes of careful conversation over tea, that she had paid $800 total before stopping, after which her shop's front window had been broken twice in a month. both incidents documented as random vandalism. By the end of the week, Margaret had identified 7 businesses. The total monthly take was somewhere between $2,200 and $3,000, depending on which numbers were complete. Pruitt and Straw had been running the scheme for at least 9 months, possibly longer. On Thursday evening, she wrote everything down in a format she had used before: clear, sequential, sourced, each victim with initials, dates, amounts, the specific language of the implied threats. She noted the laminated card, the reference to the fictional liaison program, the fire marshal threat to Gareth, the broken windows at the bookshop. She attached a summary assessment at the top 2 officers. 14th Precinct, operating an extortion scheme under color of law. 9 months, minimum. 7 known victims. Estimated take between $20,000 and $30,000. She sent it to Holt. He read it and called back in 20 minutes. "This is clean," he said. "This is actually very clean. I had good material to work with." She said, "I'm sending it to someone at the state AG's office. I know the deputy chief of the criminal division, and I'm flagging it to a contact at Internal Affairs, someone who actually wants to do their job. I don't want it traced back to the merchants." She said, "They were already coerced once. I'll handle the sourcing. It'll come in as a third-party tip with supporting documentation. Your name won't be anywhere near it." "Good. Margaret." He paused. "What do you want to do about Friday?" Friday was when Pruitt and Straw were due to come by at 9 for her first contribution. She thought about it for a moment. "I'll be there," she said. "I'll have the money ready. Let them take it." Another pause. "You're sure? That's a cash handoff on camera in my shop." "Warren. I installed a new system last spring. 3 angles. High resolution. Audio. If they take it, they've done it in front of evidence." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, you had the camera system already?" "I had it already." She could hear him deciding whether to say something. He chose not to. "Okay," he said. "I'll make the calls tonight. The AG contact can move fast if she wants to. Internal Affairs will want to do their own surveillance. They might want to observe the Friday visit directly. Tell them they're welcome to set up on the street. The alley behind the building has a clear sight line to my front door." "Of course it does." She hung up and went to bed at 10:15, which was early for her. She slept without difficulty. Friday morning arrived with the thin, clear light that sometimes follows a week of grey. Margaret opened the shop at 7:30, as usual. She arranged a new display of late-season chrysanthemums in burgundy and bronze, brewed coffee, and turned on the small radio she kept near the register, a habit she'd maintained, because silence in a room where you are waiting can become its own pressure. At 8:45, she placed $400 in an envelope. She set it on the counter. At 9:03, the bell made its sound. Pruitt came in first, followed by Straw. They looked exactly the same as they had on Tuesday. Pruitt glanced at the counter, saw the envelope, and smiled. "You thought it over?" he said. "I did," Margaret said. He reached for the envelope. She let him take it. "Smart decision," he said, tucking it into his jacket. "You won't have any issues. We make sure of that." "I appreciate it," she said. Straw was looking at her with something that might have been unease, or might have been boredom. She wasn't certain he was thinking much at all. They left. She waited 3 minutes, then texted Holt completed. His reply came in under 30 seconds, confirmed. They have it all. Moving tomorrow morning. She did not find out the details of what happened Saturday morning the way she'd expected. She was in the back of the shop when Bex came in at 10 and immediately pulled up something on her phone. "Ms. Calhoun, have you seen this?" It was a local news notification. 2 officers from the 14th Precinct had been taken into custody following a joint investigation by the State Attorney General's office and the city's Internal Affairs Division. The men were identified as Dale Pruitt, Sajai, and Kevin Straw, Sanjasu. The charges included extortion under color of law, abuse of official capacity, and criminal conspiracy. According to the brief statement from the AG's office, the investigation had been ongoing for several days and involved evidence gathered from multiple sources. "Oh," said Margaret. "That's crazy," said Bex. "Right here in the neighborhood. Do you think they ever came in here?" "I don't think so." Margaret said, "Can you take over the register for a bit? I need to make a call." She stepped into the back room and called Holt. "Saw the news," she said. "It moved fast because your documentation was thorough." He said, "The AG's office had been getting general complaints about the 14th for a while, but nothing they could build on. What you put together gave them something to work with. Are the other businesses named anywhere?" "No. Victims remain protected. The initial charges are built on the evidence from the shop visit and the surveillance. Other testimony will come in the follow-on proceedings. But it won't happen immediately." "Good." She looked out the small window above the sink, where a slice of the alley was visible. "What about the captain at the 14th? Was he aware?" Holt was quiet for a moment. "That part of the investigation is ongoing," he said, which was not an answer, but was also not nothing. "Understood," she said. The weeks that followed were quiet, which was the way Margaret preferred outcomes. The AG's office issued a fuller statement 11 days after the arrests, describing the scope of the scheme and noting that additional charges were under review. A reporter from the Radcliffe Courier called the shop. They had apparently gotten her name from the Merchants Association, and she declined to comment. She referred the call to Howard, who genuinely had no idea what was going on, and told the reporter in good faith that Miss Calhoun was a very private person who mostly just cared about the flowers. This was accurate enough. The civil attorney who eventually contacted her on behalf of the Victims' Coalition explained that her documented contribution provided anonymously through Holt's channels had formed the backbone of both the criminal case and the forthcoming civil suit against the city. He thanked her with the slightly baffled warmth of someone who understands they are dealing with a person who knows more than they've been told. She thanked him in return and asked if there was anything further she needed to provide. There wasn't. Gareth Soules stopped by the shop one afternoon in November, under the pretext of dropping off a button he'd found near their shared exterior wall. He handed it to her, then stood there for a moment with the air of someone who had something to say and wasn't sure how to say it. "I heard they got arrested," he said. "I heard that too," she said. He nodded. He looked at the button in her hand, small, dark, unremarkable. "That's funny," he said. "Someone takes care of a problem like this. You'd think, I don't know. You'd think it'd have to be somebody with connections, resources. You know, you'd think," Margaret said. "But it's a flower shop," he said, mostly to himself. "Just a flower shop. Radcliffe is a good neighborhood," she said. "It protects its own." He left, and she set the button on the shelf behind the register, where she kept small things she didn't intend to throw away. Dale Pruitt pleaded guilty in February to 2 counts of extortion under color of law. Kevin Straw, who had cooperated with investigators in the weeks following the arrest, received a reduced charge in exchange for testimony that helped establish the scheme's timeline and, more significantly, identify 2 additional officers who had been aware of and occasionally participated in the collection runs. Those 2 officers were charged separately in March. The commanding officer of the 14th Precinct, a captain named Roland Vess, was placed on administrative leave, pending a departmental review. That review, as of the following summer, remained ongoing. The city settled the civil claims brought by the 7 affected businesses without going to trial. The settlement terms were not disclosed, but Gareth Soules used his portion to fix the ventilation system that Pruitt had threatened him about, which he pointed out with some satisfaction At the next Merchants Association meeting, Margaret attended that meeting, as she attended every meeting, and said little, and brought good coffee. In April, Bex, who was finishing her junior year and had started asking thoughtful questions about things that happened in the world, told Margaret over lunch that the whole situation had made her think about how often people just paid when they were threatened because they didn't know they had other options. That's true. Margaret said, someone must have helped them. Bex said, the merchants. Someone must have put it together. Probably. Margaret said, do you think it was someone in the neighborhood? Someone we'd know? Margaret considered her dahlia, which she had trimmed that morning, and which was doing exactly what she'd expected. People are more capable than they look sometimes. She said, that's the thing about a place like this. You see someone every day, and you think you know who they are. But people have layers. Bex thought about this. That's kind of comforting. Actually, she said, I think so too. Margaret said, on the anniversary of the shop's opening, which fell on a Thursday in early May. Margaret unlocked the door at 7:30, hung a small bunch of sweet peas in the window, as she always did on that date, and made herself a cup of coffee. She stood at the counter for a moment in the quiet before the day began, looking at the space she had built, the careful arrangements, the soft smell of soil and greenery, the tired little bell above the door. She had been asked, years ago in a debrief, what she considered the most important skill she'd developed in her work. She'd said patience, the ability to wait without urgency, to know that most situations, given the right conditions and the right time, would resolve the way they were supposed to. The bell made its sound. The first customer of the day walked in, an elderly man who came every Thursday for a small bunch of whatever was in season to leave at his wife's grave. He had been doing this for 6 years. He always said good morning. He never wanted to talk. Margaret smiled at him, moved to the cooler, and began to build the arrangement. The day went on. Outside, Radcliffe was ordinary and bright, and entirely unaware of most of what moved through it, which was, Margaret thought, exactly as it should be. The best outcomes left no visible seams, just a neighborhood that worked the way it was supposed to, and a woman who sold flowers, and a bell that didn't ask too many questions. She wrapped the stems in brown paper and handed them across the counter. Same as always, she said. Same as always. He said. She watched him go, and then she turned back to the dahlias, and the morning began.